During the last years, Dr. Lanek has scientifically prepared more than 1 million plants. This research, important for genetics, yielded many useful results, but no confirmation of the theory of evolution.
99.9% of all mutations lead to gene function impairment or loss of gene function. And here, an important point is often confused. One important point is not seen precisely. Namely, the variability we observe does not explain the development of the genes we need to explain new species, new families, new orders, and new classes. Due to this immense amount of tendrils formed, this pea does not need additional methods to grow upright, but holds itself mutually up on its own. However, in nature, this is a loss. Such a pea has no chance to prevail in nature. And this is true in principle for almost all crop plants.
In his projects at the Max Planck Institute, Dr. Lanek finds numerous mutants that have some kind of loss. This plant, for example, is missing its chromium leaves, and in another, the flowers are so deformed into tubes that bumblebees can no longer enter them for pollination, so that hardly any seeds can be formed. In addition, rainwater remains in the flower tubes.
The rule seems to be, because we have made experiments with some hundreds of plants, that we could not prevent the plants from decaying prematurely or producing any seed.
Whole armies of flies have been sacrificed to mutation in recent decades. Result: regular loss of function at the genetic level, loss of eye color, mutilation of wings, and many other deformities. In humans, the actual character of mutations is even more obvious, namely as a genetic loss of function leading to sometimes severe diseases. So-called positive mutations, that is, the creation of new genes, are not known to date.
And here lies the decisive question, which the theory of evolution is still unable to answer. How do completely new gene functions arise, completely new gene families, completely new gene action chains? And so, just thinking further, how did life arise in the first place? How do new species arise, new forms, new organisms? And in the textbook, of course, everything is already completely clarified. But there are still no examples where mutations have created completely new gene functions.
Geneticist Lanek is not alone in his view. The biologist and Nobel Prize winner Carl von Frisch explained, "I am convinced that mutation and selection alone cannot explain the processes in living nature." But how then should life? How should the different species have come into being? Do not the Darwinists claim numerous fossils which confirm the theory of evolution? Such a fossil was found here in today's Altmühltal. More than 150 million years ago, a shallow bay is said to have been here, which was shielded to the south towards the open sea by a coral reef belt. Storms over the sea washed water masses into this basin, and with them, sea animals that died in the poisonous lagoon water. Sucked to the bottom, they were covered with fine lime mud and preserved. In 1868, 2 years after the publication of Darwin's main work, a sensational find was made in one of the Solenhof quarries. The fossil of a strange bird that was to be given the name Archaeopteryx. Darwin welcomed this find, but was generally disappointed with the fossils. He wrote,
"So why doesn't every geological formation and every layer teem of intercalated species? Geology by no means shows us an unbroken chain of organic life. And this is perhaps the most serious objection that can be raised against my theory. When Darwin expressed his ideas about the origin of species at that time, it was immediately clear there must be a missing link, a transitional form between reptiles and birds. Because in part, there were reptilian features, like this long, bony tail, the toothed jaws in the skull. But on the other hand, they had these animal feathers. So it had to be a bird, so it had to be a transitional form between the reptiles and the birds. One of the many puzzles in evolutionary theory is how a reptilian scale could have produced a bird feather. If you think about how many genes accomplish the construction of a bird feather, you don't really know. But you would guess that it might be 200 or 300 or 500 different genes. Where do these genes come from? The blueprint for a shed is fundamentally and completely different from the blueprint for a bird feather. How individual genes are supposed to have changed so that a reptile scale gradually becomes a bird feather through the accumulation of mutations is completely unknown. For this, we don't even have a wild speculation that has any basis in modern molecular genetics. We must simply admit that we have no clue.
After more than 100 years, even Darwinists have begun to doubt whether Archaeopteryx can be described as a link between reptiles and birds.
Today, it is considered that this animal is not directly a transitional form, that is the origin of the bird's pedigree, but that it is a reptile in one part and a bird in the other. That is a combination of characteristics from both classes of animals. And as some details on the skeleton in particular showed this animal, that is Archaeopteryx, will not directly lead on to the birds of today, but represents a separate stage of development, which, however, makes it clear that we still do not know the actual origin of the birds.
This well-preserved fossil from the collection of the Natural History Museum of Berlin probably simply represents the petrification of an extinct bird species. It may have special characteristics, but these are also found in birds living today. For example, in the case of werebirds, the bony thorn at the site of the wings where Archaeopteryx had his sharp claws is visible to everyone. Hardly anyone would conclude that the werebird is a transitional form between reptiles and birds. But this is exactly what Archaeopteryx has been claimed for centuries. In the course of time, almost all scientists agree a large part of the formerly living animal tribes became extinct. The origin of these tribes, however, is shrouded in mystery by the theory of evolution. This has not changed since huge quantities of fossils were found, which are now stored in natural history museums.
Now, it has been known for a long time that there is a very interesting cut in the history of the Earth, where the Precambrian passes into the Cambrian. The Precambrian is the Paleozoic, and from the Cambrian onwards, one finds multicellular organisms, animal organisms, and the transition from the Precambrian to the Cambrian is extremely sharp. You only find bacteria over a radiometric time of nearly 3 billion years, and then suddenly, when you look in the sediments, from 1 meter of sediment to the next, there are suddenly 18 different animal strains in the Cambrian. And this phenomenon has been known for a long time. It has also become known in scientific literature as the mysterious explosion of animal life in the Precambrian.
Although several other life forms from this period have been found, the mystery of the Precambrian has remained unsolved until today. Even Darwin knew of the erratic appearance of the higher organisms in the Cambrian. He wrote,
To the question why we don't find rich fossil deposits in the Precambrian period, I can't give a satisfactory answer.
For the theory of evolution, the bacteria seemed to be ideal research objects to experimentally prove the higher development by accidental mutation.
Evolutionary change in living things takes time, many generations of time. But now, There are organisms, that is the bacteria, which double very quickly. A bacteria cell can double in 20 minutes. That means we can have 3 generations in 1 hour, 30 generations in 10 hours, 300 generations of bacteria in 100 hours. Or, in other words, in 1 year, we can observe as many generations of bacteria in the laboratory as we assume to have passed from the origin of the human ancestor to modern man. This is what we can observe and measure with bacteria in 1 year.
With the help of such ideal conditions, the theory of higher development should be easily proven.
Now we have been doing research on bacteria for many, many decades, and the result of evolutionary research on bacteria can be said in one sentence. Something fundamentally new has not come out of it. We do not find any indication that new structures are created in a bacterium, that a higher development takes place in a bacterium. The level of complexity of the bacterium remains the same over many 1,000, even umpteen 1,000 generations. We have, as in the only area where we can measure enough generations in the laboratory, there we have the result that we cannot observe evolution, no higher development.
And this with supposedly primitive organisms from which, according to the theory of evolution, all higher life forms are taught to have descended from.
Bacteria are anything but primitive. They are highly complicated cells. They have 5,000 genes, about 5 million base pairs in their genome, and we are just beginning to understand what this complicated wealth of information actually does on such a bacterial genome. And we just saw it on the screen, how the cells are swimming around and they are driven by a real small electric motor. And here you see the scourge. It's like a propeller in a ship's engine. This scourge is set into rotation by the engine, which we see here bigger in this schematic drawing. Up here we have the scourge. Then this scourge is attached to the axis of the engine by a connector. In order for the motor to run stable, this axis must be stabilized, and this is done here by the 2 bearings of the axis. Also, the motor needs a part that makes the axle turn. These are the motor proteins you see here. Then there is an unknown structure down here, and the control proteins that tell the motor whether it should turn left or right and how fast the motor should turn.
And this highly complicated organism is supposed to have been created by chance? Nobody would think that, for example, one of our large marine diesel engines came about by chance. Especially those involved in the planning and production of such a masterpiece know about the use of intelligence, planning, and organization. Yet this engine is incomparably more primitive than the allegedly accidental bacterial engine.
To write the construction plan for a bacteria engine, you need about 60,000 letters. Now you can simply assume that you only need 50 of these 60,000 letters to make an engine. The rest can vary somehow. If you now estimate a probability that such an engine could be created, that nevertheless, in 1,000 times the Earth's history, the probability for the creation of this engine is so small that you just don't expect it. Even if the Earth were 10,000 times as old as it is today, one would still not expect an engine with these 50 building blocks to be created just once.
Even Darwin suspected that his random theory would not be able to satisfactorily explain the development of complicated processes and organs such as the human eye. But if the eye cannot explain the evolutionary process with the theory of evolution, how can the human being as a whole? If the factors, mutation, selection, and chance have been overestimated, then science and all those who have put their trust into it have unexpectedly let themselves themselves be led into a dead end by its answers. Just the Neanderthal man has got a very bad picture in the public, associated as an intermediate form between ape and man with stooped gait. All this is absolutely not true. The last 20 to 30 years of Neanderthal research bring new results every year that make us more and more amazed about the high level of development that the Neanderthal basically had. So in no way somehow standing below us or less intelligent or more primitive developed or so.